Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Elected Essentials, the virtual edition. If it wasn't for COVID-19, we would be doing this training live in 12 regions across the state. But in an effort to protect everybody's safety, we're going to try and do it virtually this year. While it may not be as engaging as years past, hopefully you still learned something today. Now, let's get started. So first, for the most part, almost all cities in Oregon are what we call a council manager form of government. And that's what probably most of you are familiar with. There's a few outliers in Oregon, but most people, this is the type of government you're going to work under. And when we talk about the council manager form of government, what we like to do at the League is we like to describe it as that's your team. Each city has its own unique team. And the members of that team are traditionally composed of your city council, your mayor, your council president, a city manager, although I'll make a caveat. We typically see city managers in our larger to medium-sized cities. Once you get to a smaller type of cities, we typically call those city administrators. And then in our really small cities, you have a city recorder who acts a lot of times the same way a city administrator or city manager would. So when we use the word city manager in this program and throughout the entirety of Elected Essentials, know that we're also trying to include city administrators and in the smallest of the small cities, sometimes your recorders as well. Other two members of the team include your city staff, and last, but perhaps most importantly, they're your citizens. Citizens are part of your city. In fact, my guess is almost all of you, particularly as elected officials, you started out on the team as a citizen before you moved into becoming a city councilor, a mayor, or a council president. So, like any good team, what we need to first do is we need to define what our individual roles are. So if you're familiar with sports, then you know that whether it's baseball, football, or soccer, depending on the position you play on the team, you're going to have a different role and a different responsibility. And that's true when it comes to your team for the city. You're going to have different roles and different responsibilities. So let's first kind of take a global look at the entire council's main roles, and then we'll delve into some of those team parts that you all play. So city councils in general, this is you acting as a collective body. You really have 5 key components, and you can see them there on the slide. The first one, the one that's right in the middle, is you have centralized power. And this is really important to understand. A lot of times the League will get a call and somebody will say, I was recently elected into council, and I know that I was elected because I was a champion for a particular position, and I promised the people who voted for me that I would get X accomplished in the first 6 months. And I just can't get it done. The rest of the council won't come on board. And what Jamie Hafner and I always say is, well, how many people are on your council? And if you say 5 people, Jamie and I are going to respond by saying, then you need to learn to count to 3. And what I mean is you're going to have to get a majority of your council to agree with you. And that's because individual councilors and individual mayors don't have their own inherent power. All of your power as a council member is wrapped up into the centralized council. It's the council who makes decisions, not individual councilors. And it's really important that we keep that in mind, because what that does is it tells you what you can and cannot do, and it also forces you to work together as a team to find common ground and consensus. One of the other components of the overall council is you work as a legislative body. This is the one that you probably think the most of when you ask people what city councils do. And by a legislative body, what we typically mean is you're passing ordinances, you're essentially making local laws, and that's when you act in the legislative capacity. The next way or next role that you have is that you're your city's policymakers. You're the big visionaries for your community. So what I like to say is you get to sit down as a city council and figure out, where is my council going? What is important to my city? What do we want it to look like in 5 years, in 10 years? So you take the big view of your community and you put together plans and documents and guiding principles that set your city on the path that you have planned. So you are in charge of the big picture for your community. You also have limited hiring authority. Most councils in Oregon only are allowed to hire, supervise, and fire 1 to maybe 3 employees. So the big one is usually the city manager. You are typically the entity that hires, reviews, evaluates, and terminates your city manager. You also typically are the entity that gets to hire the city attorney, and again, you could terminate the city attorney as well. And in some limited instances, there are a few cities in Oregon where the city council hires the police chief. But regardless, that's it. That's the only person you get to hire, supervise, and fire. And if you want to know who you get to hire, supervise, and fire, you're going to find that in your city charter. And if it's not given the council authority to hire somebody in the charter, then that's it. You get to control those specifically identified people. The last overall general role that your council is going to play is with limited administrative and quasi-judicial powers. So what does this mean? It kind of seems like lawyer speak, and it probably is. So the administrative role is really, it's kind of almost straightforward. It's where you're not passing laws, but you're taking almost some type of internal type of action or something that's not binding. So for example, there's two key ways that I describe administrative powers. So let's say, for example, that your city wants to adopt a new personnel manual that applies to your entire employees, because that's kind of a big policy, right? It's not whether or not you're hiring, subordinate employees or firing them. You're really kind of setting the policy for how employees are treated in your organization. So when you adopt that new personnel manual, you're probably doing it via a resolution instead of passing it as an ordinance. And so that would be one example of you utilizing your administrative powers. Another one would be when you've already had an ordinance, and the ordinance says we've got to do X, Y, and Z, and then we can issue a permit to somebody. So let's say you've got a business license ordinance in your community. Your ordinance is going to say we need these 10 things to come from an applicant, and if we get those things, then we have to issue them a business permit. So when you as a city council issues that business permit, you're not really using any discretionary actions, you're just acting in an administrative capacity. You're checking to make sure those 10 things were submitted, and then you're administratively issuing them the business permit. Your quasi-judicial powers, that's really when you're kind of acting like a judge almost, which is why you see the word judicial in there. So when you are typically going to see this, in my experience as a city council, is in a land use context or if you're revoking some type of permit. So let's go back to that business permit example. So let's say you as a city have issued a business permit to XYZ company. And your city manager comes to you one day and says, hey, XYZ company has violated the terms of their permit, and we are going to terminate their permit. We're going to revoke it. So the city manager revokes the permit, and then the business owner appeals to the city council and says, revoking my permit was wrong, I didn't do anything incorrectly, I'm entitled to have that permit back. And so that appeal is coming to you as a city council. And when you are hearing that appeal, you're going to be acting as a judge. And what's different when you're acting as a judge with your quasi-judicial powers is you have to kind of behave the same way you would expect any judge to behave. And that means you can't really get any information from outside of your hearing. So if XYZ business owner wants to approach you in the grocery store before the hearing and tell you their side of the story, can't do that because you'd be getting information outside the hearing. So you really almost have to think of yourself. If I was going into a court hearing myself, how would I expect a judge to behave? And that's typically what you're going to need to do. My guess is when you get to your first land use hearing, either your city planner or your city attorney is going to give you some more specific instructions on what you need to do in quasi-judicial context, but as a baseline understanding, it's really where you need to be fair and impartial, and you're making your decisions based on the facts and the evidence you hear during the hearing itself and nothing else. Okay, so that's generally what the city council is going to do as a whole. And so one of the big questions that we get a lot at the league is, okay, great, we kind of know a summary of what we're supposed to do, Patty, but how do we specifically know what we have to do in our own particular community? And there's usually 3 areas that you can look at for that. The first is going to be your city charter. That's a big one. That's kind of akin to your U.S. Constitution or your state constitution. Your city's charter is essentially your city's constitution. It's the number one governing document that you have. So that's the first place. It's not on the slide, but another place that you're also going to find your powers and authority are sometimes in your municipal code or standalone ordinances. And one of the key places I often see something becoming part of your code is when your council adopts rules of procedure. So rules of procedure are really going to dictate how your council acts when it meets. So it's going to define who gets called on, who sets the agenda, how much time the public is given to speak on something, how those rules can be changed. And we'll see a lot of cities take those rules of procedure and actually adopt them as ordinances into their code. And then the other place is sometimes policies and procedural manuals. So what you'll see occasionally is it's kind of a lower level of criteria that city councils sometimes have to use. And those are rare, we don't see them as much, but those are kind of the core characteristics where you say, I want to know what I'm supposed to do in this situation, or I want to understand my role better. You want to look at those documents. I would typically say, what are your city's governing documents? And those are going to be included there, and that's going to tell you what you need to do. So then you have your mayor. So in a lot of instances, the mayor is part of the council. Sometimes in some cities in Oregon, the council actually appoints the mayor directly from their own ranks. In some cities, the mayor is elected at large from members of the community. But in almost every case of a charter that I've read in Oregon, your mayors have specific tasks. And what I'm going to tell you is to know exactly what you can do as a mayor in your city is read your charter, read your ordinances, and read your rules of procedure. They're going to give you specific instructions on what you are expected to do and what you can do as a mayor. But generally, there are three key roles that we do expect mayors to play, and they're pretty consistently defined this way in your charters. The first is that the mayor tends to be the public face of the community, right? They're the person who represents the city at city events. So you open a new dog park, it's probably the mayor who's cutting the ribbon. You want somebody to go and speak to the media about a recent ordinance that was passed, it's probably the mayor who's the face of the community. They are the person who is kind of the face of the city and the spokesperson for the council. That's their number one role. The second role, and probably where the mayor wields the most power, is with the presiding officer position. And what I mean by that is the mayor is the chair of the council. So what we typically see is that it's the mayor who works with city staff to set the agenda for council meetings. It's the mayor who opens council meetings. It's the mayor who calls on different councilors and recognizes them before they can speak or make comment during those meetings. And unfortunately, sometimes, because it is a city council meeting, there will be conflict. And it will, at some point in your career, probably happen where you and another councilor have a difference of opinion. And it will be up to the mayor to make sure that that difference remains professional and respectful, that people aren't talking over each other, cutting each other off, hopefully never reducing ourselves to calling each other names. So they are the presiding officer. It's also really common as a presiding officer that the mayor has authority to appoint members of the public and councilors to city committees. So, for example, a lot of cities will have committees on parks, or if your city has an annual festival that's really important to you, and it's always organized each year by a committee, a lot of times what you'll see is the charter will give the mayor authority to appoint persons to serve on those committees. And one of the last things that we see mayors do as presiding officers is they sign on the dotted line, so to speak. It's their John Hancock on the ordinances that you pass, on the resolutions that you pass, and on contracts that the city enters into. So they're kind of a preeminent signer of all city documents. And the last main role that I like to say mayors play is they are your city's chief facilitator. And by that, I mean they're the person who's facilitating discussions amongst councilors as a council, and they also try and facilitate dialogue between the council and the city manager. What I've seen in a lot of cities in my years of experience is that city managers will regularly meet with their mayors, maybe once a week, and they will meet with individual councilors, but that's maybe only once every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. So it's kind of up to the mayor during council meetings to kind of keep everybody abreast and facilitate that information and those discussions. So they are the organization's chief facilitator, both externally and internally. So your council president. So some cities also have what's called a council president position. And in my experience, what typically happens is when the council convenes at the first meeting in January, they elect from among their membership a council president. One of the main things that a council president does is that they act as a mayor when the mayor is absent from one of the meetings. So that means that if the mayor is absent, it's the council president who's going to become the chief facilitator, is going to become the public face of the community. They are going to assume the entire role of the mayor. In some cities, you'll see on the slide there, the council president is actually elected to represent the councilors themselves. So they're not just stepping in kind of as the mayor, they're also the council's chosen candidate to kind of be the council's spokesperson as well. So it's kind of a little bit higher priority of the overall council. And then depending on your charter provisions, a lot of times I will see that when council presidents take over, they don't lose any of the power. And by that I mean there's a lot of cities in Oregon where the mayor only gets to vote in the event of a tie. And so when the council president, who always gets to vote, assumes the role of mayor, because the mayor's absent, the council president will retain the right to vote, even though they are technically acting in the mayor's absence. So your other key figure on your city team is going to be your city manager. And remember, I said at the beginning, we're not trying to exclude anybody, so this can include city administrators. And if you're a recorder in a small city, a lot of these duties may seem like they're exactly yours as well. But I'm going to use city managers generally because that's what we predominantly see. So your city manager is basically the CEO of your city. They're the person who's running the ship. So what this means is that it's the city manager who manages all of the city staff. So if you're a small city and you only have 4 employees, the city manager manages 4 employees. If you're a big city, I came from a really big city where we had about 500 employees, and the city manager would be managing 500 employees. It also means that as a city manager, you hire, recruit, supervise, evaluate, and fire all of those employees. That's the city manager's job, not the city council's job. The city manager is typically the person who's in charge of preparing or at least overseeing the development of the budget that is going to be presented to the city council for adoption. And ultimately, what I like to say is if you remember back when we talked about the city council's role, we talked about how the council is the visionary for the city. You kind of set the plan, and you give that vision and the plan to the city manager. The city manager takes that plan from you, and they then put it into effect. So they're responsible for taking the council's vision and making that vision come to life. That's one of the key things that city managers do. The other main job that city managers do is that they are the chief advisor to city councils. They're the person that's supposed to give you all of their professional advice, their respected advice, their trusted advice. They are your advisor. They provide you objective information, data, any research or information you need to make your decisions as policymakers are going to come from your city manager or other staff that the city manager relies upon. They're going to give you their analysis and their assessment, and then you get to decide what to do. I always used to tell my council, you don't have to take my advice, you don't get to tell me what my advice is. And it's the same for a city manager. So the city manager is going to give you their best advice on how to proceed with an action, and it's up to you to decide whether you follow it or not. But you don't, as a councilor, get to tell the city manager, this is the advice you have to give me, if that makes sense. So this diagram is an interesting one. I pulled it actually from the International City County Management Association, one of their trainings. So it's not mine or the league's, and in full disclosure here. What I like this chart for is if you look at the bottom chart, you'll kind of see a dotted line that kind of works its way down. What it is intending to show is that the relationship between the council and the city manager is really one that kind of ebbs and flows. So if you take, for example, while the city council is creating the vision, right, that's your job. At the same time, you're going to have the city manager and their staff giving you input and guidance on what should or should not go into that vision. So it's a symbiotic relationship where we're kind of always working together and there's this influx. And so you're going to constantly see a connection between the two types of roles that those specific teammates play. So it's one thing to say, well, this is my job as a council to set the vision. That's correct. But remember, your city manager is your chief policy advisor. So they're going to help you build that vision. You get to decide what it is, but you should probably rely on your city staff for some support in that. So it works together. Okay, so that kind of explains generally what the various members of the team on a city council do, or at least the 3-4 main components of the teammates. The next thing that we want to talk about today is how that team comes together to form a high-functioning city council. This part of the program, I will be honest, is usually a lot more interesting and easy to explain when we're in person, because I like to talk about this program and do a lot of live Q&A as we work through the slides, but we're going to try and make do today. So there's 3 things I want you to try and remember when we talk about developing a high-functioning city council. The first is, are we acting as a group or are we acting as a team? Then we're going to go through some habits of effective city councils that we've seen. And lastly, we're going to talk about the importance of communication. In my experience, after almost 20 years in the profession, most of the issues that I've experienced with any group that I've worked with is a breakdown in communication. So we're going to talk about some important keys to communication so that breakdown hopefully doesn't happen in your community. So group versus team. This is the first example of why this presentation is better live than recorded. So what we've got here is an airplane full of passengers. And if I actually had people in front of me today, what I would be doing is asking you, is this picture one that identifies a group or does it identify a team? And since nobody can talk back to me, I'm going to go ahead and throw out some of the answers I typically get. So the typical answer usually is, well, it's a group. Well, why is it a group? Most people say it's a group because on average, most of those people on the plane probably have no idea who the other person is. They don't really have anything in common. There's nothing connecting them together other than they're sitting on the same plane, hoping it takes off on time, and they don't have turbulence. But if you throw in a hypothetical, okay, but is there a team at all in there? Well, the flight attendants, they're probably a team, right? If you think about it, they all have a common purpose, they clearly work well to each other, they know each other, and they have common goals. So they're probably a team. And then, if my worst personal nightmare happens and the plane crashes and you're in the middle of the ocean and you've got to deploy life safety measures, my guess is that entire plane is going to become a team out of necessity. Because all of a sudden they have a common goal, right? They want to survive. So you're going to see a group turn into a team. And the reason I always pick this slide in particular to show, particularly with new counselors, is because you probably start out as a group. You didn't know each other. You didn't all agree to a common goal when you met each other. You were just a group of people. But over time, if you work well together, my guess is you're going to become a team. So it's kind of like the passengers on the plane in the event of emergency. You're probably capable of going from a group to a team. So, some core characteristics of the differences between those two. A group is generally considered to be a bunch of people who are independent of each other, and each member has a different set of tasks. So they don't necessarily work together, they just kind of work separately and have their own ideas of where they should go. And because members work individually, their work product is also valued independently. So there's not a collective team grade, if you will. Whereas a team is comprised of people who are all working together, and their tasks, even if they are interdependent, rely on one another for the team to be successful. And it's composed of people who are dependent on one another. They're going to share responsibilities, not just for their wins, but also for their losses, and they're going to be judged as a collective. So if you think about, let's take, for example, sometimes when a city ends up in the news. Let's say you pass as a city council a really controversial ordinance. So 55% of the community is woohoo, super happy, and the other half of the community thinks you've just done the most terrible thing you could ever do. They're probably usually not calling out Counselor A or Council B. They're referring to, I hate the city council, or I love what my city council just did. And that's because you're a team. You're being judged based on your collective efforts and your collective achievements. So those are kind of the characteristics that define the difference between a group and a team. And from my perspective, a team is where you need to be as a city council. They're more effective, and in reality, that's how you're going to be judged and critiqued by the citizens and, to some extent, city staff. So how do we go about building a team? So I like to share the principles of a team. This is not mine. This is from a psychologist. I can't remember their name right now. But they've indicated, and I agree, that these are kind of the main principles of a team. So we've got to have a shared understanding. So what is that shared understanding as your city? A lot of times you'll see this in the form of what I like to call strategic plans. So it's really common in the early part of any new calendar year for your city council to sit down and say, okay, what is our strategic plan for the year? Some cities do it 2 years, 3 years, 4 years out, but what do we want to achieve this year? And that becomes your shared understanding of what we're going to do and how we're going to move forward as a city. The second part is shared ownership. So even if, let's say you have a council of 7, and let's say you all pass your strategic plan for the year, but you are one of those 7 counselors, and you think, you know what? I really didn't agree with goal 6. I don't think it's an issue we should be focusing on right now. But you know what? It made it in there. That was the consensus. You should still, as a counselor, share the ownership in goal 6 in the entire document, because it may not have been what you wanted, but it is part of the overall understanding that your community and your council came up with. So you're going to share ownership in that document and share ownership in the results that come from that document. The other key one is everyone has to contribute. My guess is all of us have played on some team before where there's always that one person who's kind of always going for the ball, right, so to speak, and the other person who's always kind of hanging back. Or if I remember from group projects in high school or college, right, there's always that one person who's like, I know the answer, I know the answer, I know the answer, and the other person who's kind of a little bit quieter, just sitting back there. What's important to remember when you build a team is that everyone has to contribute. So it can't always be the person saying, I have the answer, I have the answer. You're going to have to take that person who's normally quiet and bring them in. Their contribution matters just as much. So you're going to have to make sure that you're all part of the team. And that's part of how you build a shared understanding, and then you can take joint ownership in whatever outcome you create. There has to be room for everyone to express ideas and opinions. Some people, like me, have absolutely no problem sharing their ideas and opinions. But if I was part of a team, it can't just be about what I want. I have to ask the rest of my team, what do you want? What's your idea and what's your opinion? Because everybody should be valued the same. And again, that all builds up to having that shared ownership and shared understanding. And this is a hard one for a lot of people. You can't feel threatened by conflict. A lot of people are really uncomfortable with conflict, right? It doesn't feel good when people disagree with one another. Some people get like a pit in their stomach and you think, ugh, I just don't want any conflict. And I look at conflict a little differently. I actually think conflict is healthy. I don't think fighting, yelling, screaming, and calling names is healthy, but conflict in and of itself is not inherently bad, particularly if you can find a way to work through that conflict respectfully and productively. Because what conflict actually does, if you think about it, is it forces us to open ourselves up to new ideas and new concepts. So what you want to try and convey to team members who may feel uncomfortable with conflict is, it's normal. I'm not always going to agree with you. You're not always going to agree with this other counselor. But we need these differences of opinions because they represent ourselves truly. They probably represent what some of our community members feel. And we need to be able to discuss and work out that conflict so we can actually find consensus to build our city and move it forward. And part of not being threatened by conflict is the next note on your slide, an atmosphere of trust and encouragement. And trust is hard to kind of develop when you start up on a team, right? You don't just inherently trust the person sitting next to you at a council meeting because they're your counselor. You may have realistically just met them 2 hours ago. But you've got to build an atmosphere where you can trust that everybody's coming forward with the best of intents. And that comes with the encouragement part. So let's encourage each other to be honest, open, and forthright and start to build that trust. What I've often found in my work with city councils is that even when there is a split in the council and side A feels passionately about one way and side B feels passionately the other, while they seem completely different, the reality is at the core, both A and B ultimately want what's best for their community. And that's a starting point. And if you can trust that your colleagues are always coming from a place of wanting to do best for their community, you can find a way to build that consensus. And then this one at the end is kind of duplicative in terms of everyone contributes. But I do think it is worth noting that everybody has to participate in the decision making. So I worked with the city council one time where I had a counselor who never explained their vote, was not one to comment, would vote every time, but we never really had an understanding for their decision-making process. And we were having a work session one day, and the mayor actually called the counselor out and said, you know, when you don't tell us the reasons behind your votes, it's hard for us to know where you're coming from, to understand what you want to accomplish, and to really build a consensus and a team, because you're silent until the vote comes. And we really need that dialogue and that input. And what my mayor was really saying was, I need you to participate actively in the decision making. And decision making isn't just voting, it's giving the reasons behind the decision you're making and playing a role in the full process. So think about that when you're trying to build your team as a city council. So, habits of highly effective councils, other words, teams. What do we see? And some of these we've talked about before, but I think one of the key habits is you're thinking and acting strategically. So one of the things that Jamie and I have seen sometimes when we go and work with councils who are experiencing a little bit of distress is they either A, don't have a strategic plan, they haven't set goals for themselves, or B, they set goals and then they literally put the goals on a shelf and never looked at them again. And it's really hard to work together as a team if you don't know what your end goal is. And the only way to identify what your end goal is to develop those goals. So highly effective councils not only take the time to develop their strategic goals, they actually make sure that they're actively working towards achieving those goals throughout the year or 2 years or 3 years. They also understand and demonstrate teamwork. So it's one thing to say, yeah, I attended the elected essentials, I heard all this stuff about teamwork, I believe in it, but are you actually demonstrating it? And no one's perfect at it. You're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes, I'm sure, with the teams I sit on at the league. But you should, if you can, try to really demonstrate that each day. And I really like the photo of the crew team because the reality is, if one person starts rowing in the opposite direction, it throws the entire thing off. It's just not going to work. And that's kind of the same way with city councils. You've all got to row together. So this slide, there's a lot. It's probably even hard for you to maybe see if you're watching this on a computer screen. So this talks about an effective small group. So almost all city councilors are what I would define as a small group. And some keys to those effective small group situations are to really have solid interpersonal skills, be really good at your task skills, and also have some solid rational skills. And I don't want to read the whole slide to you, but for interpersonal skills, we're talking about what I like to consider soft skills, right? Am I listening to this person? Am I being supportive of this person? It's the feel-good stuff that lawyers like me aren't particularly great at. Those are your interpersonal skills. Because I'm going to tell you, especially if you're new to city council, at some point in your tenure, you're probably going to experience a really contentious issue as a body, and those interpersonal skills are going to come in handy to making sure you don't end up in some massive discourse. Task skills. You have to know how to do your job. Now, if this is the first time you're sitting on city council, it would be perfectly reasonable for you to say, I have no idea what my job is. Fair, totally fair. But you can ask your city manager, you can ask your counselor, you can read your charter, read your rules of procedure, and figure out what skills you're supposed to have, and then start developing them. What I always tell people is, it's great if you've read your charter, but it's probably not something you should read only once. It's probably something you should read at least once every 6 months. Same thing for your rules of procedure. Those are going to tell you what some of your task skills are, and it's going to help you be a better member of your small group. And then your rational skills. So the ability to be objective is how I like to say this. So sometimes it's hard, right? So I always give this example. We were working in my city on an ordinance to regulate pawn shops in a way they didn't want to be regulated. And we had, for our community, having 20 people at a public comment was pretty normal. We had maybe 40 people come out that day. And when it was all over, my deputy mayor said, I don't know, Patty, 40 people came out. Do we have this wrong? And I will admit this, wrongly, very flippantly said, I think that means 69,980 people don't care, sir, because that plus 40 would have equaled my city's population. But what it almost forced us to do when I made that comment was to go back and look at it objectively. We just spent 2.5 hours listening to 40 people tell us we were wrong, we were horrible, and we were awful. Well, let's go back to the data. Not that their feelings don't count and their opinions don't count, they truly do count, but let's objectively weigh their feelings, their comments, their testimony against all of the other information and evidence we have in front of us. Those are the rational skills that you're going to need to display as a city councilor. The other part of a highly effective team is knowing what your role is. And that's what we talked about when we first started. And the reason this matters is because you don't want to step outside of your role. So I always think back to when my nephews were little, and 4 or 5, and they played t-ball. If you've ever watched little kids play t-ball, it's hilarious. It's awesome because nobody knows their role, right? So, somebody hits the ball to first base and everybody from the outfield, third base, everybody runs to first base. Nobody respects the fact that the first base person is the person who's supposed to get the ball. They're like, ball, so we all run. It's cute when you're 4. That probably wouldn't be great if that's what the New York Yankees were doing. If the third baseman was constantly trying to run across the field to the first baseman to catch a ball in his area, you'd have some pretty big conflict on that team. So the whole purpose of the first part of the session of what your role is really comes into your ability to be an effective team here. By knowing your role and responsibilities and sticking to it, you help ensure that your whole team can be effective. Status. This is a big one. You should be consistently evaluating your policy implementation. What I think most organizations, and not just cities, do is we spend a whole lot of time organizing a policy, creating a policy, drafting an ordinance, identifying a new program, and we're super proud of it, and we spend a lot of time in it, and then we never go back and say, did we get it right? Was there room for improvement? Or did we get it completely wrong? Really solid teams are constantly evaluating how their policies have been implemented because it allows them to grow, it allows them to move forward, and it allows them to pivot and change when necessary. The other hard thing that I think is going to be hard for anybody is allocating your time appropriately. And that's hard, particularly if you're a new counselor. My guess is if you are new to elected office, you're going to spend the first 6 months to a year feeling like you're drinking from a fire hose instead of a fountain. You got a lot coming at you, you're learning new techniques, and what's really hard is I don't know what I'm supposed to spend time on. And knowing how to allocate your time is really going to help you as a council be effective. So how much time do you spend on goal setting versus exploring and analysis? How much time do you spend on legislation versus talking with your community? And it's an intricate balance, and what I would suggest to you new counselors is rely on the seasoned counselors who are already there and your city staff and figure out what works comfortably for you. But you're going to have to allocate your time appropriately in order to be an effective council. This one I always like to hit home. No, your council rules of procedure. Council rules of procedure are really important. I like to hammer this one home a lot because it's super important that you not only know and understand your council rules of procedure, but that you follow those rules of procedure. So Jamie and I have gone out and worked with quite a few councils on conflict management resolution, and I would say a lot of the time, they have really solid council rules of procedure. So, you're reading them and we're like, these are really good. I like these. I think these are pretty solid. And then we'll watch some of their council meetings and it's abundantly clear they're not following their rules of procedure. And that's part of the breakdown. And I think that the reason, objectively, why councils don't follow their rules is because rules are really formal, right? They feel really restrictive, and gosh, do we really need to be specifically recognized by the mayor before we speak when it's clear nobody else is speaking and I'm not going to be interrupting? Can't we just all be collegial and get along? I mean, this is really easy. And what I always tell people is, I absolutely understand. I think that makes complete sense. And 99% of the time, that's fine. But when you find yourself in that difficult council meeting, when tempers are short, emotions are running high, now's the time you suddenly want to enforce the rules of procedure? Now suddenly enforcing the rules of procedure almost seems like a weapon instead of a tool. You're using the rules against me now. And so if you can, even if it feels super formal and super unnecessary because we're not that big of a council and we usually all get along, if you always follow the rules of procedure, then they don't become a weapon when you're in that high-charge situation. And it almost becomes routine. Like, it just sets normal operating procedures for you as a council. I mean, if you think about it realistically, if you're playing on a basketball team, you don't pick and choose what rules you want to follow depending on the game. The rules are the rules, and you're going to be held accountable for those rules at each game. And the same should be true for your city council. The next thing you have to do to be an effective city council is you've got to ask yourselves, how do we do? You should seek objective assessments of what the council has been doing. I once had somebody say, well, we know what they think of us, Patty, because they reelected us. Really? I don't think that that's inherently true. If you just passed a massive water rate increase on October 15th and you lose at the ballot in November, did the citizens really evaluate your collective work for the last 2 years? Or did they just give you an understanding of how they felt about that water rate increase? So if you have the capacity to do some community surveys, just some general outreach, even if it's to neighborhood groups or business organizations, ask them how you did. Get the objective assessment of what's working and not working in your community so you know if you're on the right path or if you need to change directions. That's going to help you be a better team. Also, continually learn, which you're obviously doing if you have committed to sitting and watching all of Elected Essentials from your computer screen. But the more you learn, the more open you are to new ideas, new concepts, and improving your own skill set, the better able you're going to be as a community to grow. It's going to make your team more effective when you can constantly educate yourselves to think about new ideas and new ways to improve processes. So we're almost going to finish up with this session, and we're going to finish with communication, the importance of communication. I like this particular diagram. I always have. As a 41-year-old woman, what I've realized in terms of communicating with anyone is that oftentimes the words that I am saying are not the words that the other person is hearing. And that's true vice versa. And I kind of like this because I think we don't always convey what's in our head in the best way to other people we're speaking to. So, in terms of your role, particularly on the city council, I always ask this question. Do you want to be a city council that engages in debate? Or do you want to be a city council that engages in dialogue? Because I think they are two fundamentally different things. I was a competitive debater for several years when I was much younger. And I can tell you that as much as I enjoyed it, and as much as I personally love being right, I've never found debate as a successful way for getting a team to a consensus point. Dialogue works a lot better. And this chart is going to give you some simple tools on the differences between debating and dialoguing. And I'm not going to read them all. I hate when people read to me. But there's a couple in here that I really want to talk about that I think are key. First, I think style is super important. What style are you displaying? Is it a combative style, or is it one of collaboration? And some of them are simple. Are you sitting at meetings like this, with your arms all crossed up and hunched up and scowling at people? Or are you kind of open and you're more friendly and you look a little bit more approachable? Are you somebody who's slamming your fist down on something or throwing a pin in frustration? Or are you somebody who can kind of just take a breath and maintain? Our physical body cues a lot of times will speak volumes about whether we want to debate with somebody or we're trying to have a dialogue with them. Another one that I really like is the difference in critique. So are you only critiquing the other side? Because that's debating somebody. Or are you critiquing the other side and your own ideas? Because that's more of a dialogue. I would love to go through life believing that every idea I have is perfect and I am 100% correct, but that's not reality. There's probably flaws with some of my ideas. And if I'm engaging in an honest dialogue with my teammates, I should be able to critique my own ideas. What are the pros and the cons of what I'm suggesting? And last but not least, which is the one that I think is super important, especially today, is the encourage slide. We encourage searches for differences versus we encourage search for a basic agreement. So in debate, we're looking to highlight the differences between us. We fundamentally assume that there is something different in your idea versus mine. And when we dialogue with somebody, what we're actually saying is, okay, let's look for what we have in common. What are the basics of agreement? Because we can probably find some type of middle ground if we're looking for those commonalities instead of only focusing on the differences between ourselves. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of communication is, again, these come from a psychologist who identified 7 ways to improve communication during a conflict. I like them a lot. I think they're super helpful. And I would encourage people to keep them in mind when you find yourself in those difficult discussions. The first is to focus on actual behaviors and not your interpretations. So for example, if you go back to somebody who always sits like this, it's reasonable to probably interpret that they're annoyed with you, or they're hostile, or they're angry. But focus on the behavior. Could it also be that your city council chambers are really cold and they're just cold, and the reason they seem all hunched in is because they're trying to be warm? The point is to focus on the actual behavior, not what you think that behavior is trying to convey, because you're not a mind reader. Avoid the terms always and never. You always ignore me when I'm speaking. You never call on me first to give my opinion. Is that true? In my experience, the words always and never are seldom used correctly. You're probably not always called last. You're probably never the first person to not be able to speak. So don't use those absolute terms. They just seem somewhat more aggressive. Use I statements. This is a big one. So I feel that this needs to happen. When you say you are wrong or you always tell me what to do, you're accusing somebody of doing something. Flip it around. I feel like when you call on me last, you're assuming that my idea has less merit. So it's not you have called on me last and I think you're disrespectful to me. It's I am feeling this way. Put the onus back on you. Say what you want, not what you don't want. It's really common for people to say, I don't want to be called last, I don't want you to do this to me, I don't want you to do this to me. And so I'm left with a series of things that you don't want, but I may not know how to move forward because you haven't actually shared with me what you do want to see happen. So outline what's important to you and what you actually need, as opposed to simply just what you don't need. Beware of nonverbal messages. We've kind of already talked about that. Number 6 is key. Apologize for your contribution to the problem or the discord. So I can be honest, let's say, for example, that I am part of the problem. I should apologize for that. And I once had somebody say, yeah, but what if it's mostly not my fault? That's fair. Let's say 95% of the conflict is the other person's fault. You should still apologize for the 5% you played in it. Because in my experience, in order to communicate effectively with one another and to move forward, you're each going to have to own your own mistakes. So make sure that you apologize for your contributions to any miscommunications or any conflict that you're currently experiencing. And last and most importantly is give others a chance to speak. I also like to consider this one the listen to learn, not listen to respond. I think that when we're listening to respond to the other side is when we tend to kind of talk over people and interrupt people. And if you can get yourself to a point where you just sit back and listen, actually listen to what the other person is saying, because you might learn something, and it may not change your mind, but you may learn something about them or position, you're less likely to speak over them when they themselves are talking. Thanks everyone for participating and watching today. It's now time for live Q&A. I'll chat with you shortly. Good morning, everyone. I'm Patty Mulvihill, LOC's General Counsel. I'm here with my colleague, Jamie Hafner. She's LOC's Assistant General Counsel. We're into the live Q&A portion of today's segment. Hopefully the lecture you just watched wasn't too terribly long. So we will start taking questions now.
Okay, Sue, it looks like you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute your microphone, there you go, and go ahead and ask your question.
I'm learning how to use this. I am not a part of city council. I have been encouraged to attend this by a city councilor because there's a number of things, but the shortest answer is the reason for my question is I am part of a board that I was appointed, not elected, and there was such difficulty that 4 out of 5 of the people that were elected were allowed to resign rather than be fired. But there is a small group of people in the community that are reacting to the fact that we are not elected at this point, but we were appointed. And is there a way to address that, that it's not being used as a weapon against me and 4 of my other 5 colleagues?
So I want to make sure I understand the question before you unmute yourself. So you were appointed to your board to fill a vacancy, that it was essentially because the people who were elected resigned from the position. So you were appointed and now people are kind of holding your appointed status against you?
Yes.
So what I would say is, so for my first piece of advice is always unfortunately, whenever you're in the public sphere, you have to have a little bit of a thick skin, and you have to understand that you're never going to be able to please all the people all the time. It's unfortunate, but it's just kind of the skill you're going to have to develop. The second tip I would say is that I've generally found that a lot of times people are upset because they don't understand the process and the authority for that process. So what I would do is go back and work with your city manager if you have one, or your administrator, and kind of help craft some information based on your charter or your ordinances, whatever the process was that legally allowed them to appoint you to that position and why, and just start kind of almost an education campaign. Look, I understand that I wasn't elected. This is why I was appointed, and even though I didn't run for office, I still took the same oath of office. I still have the same obligations that the elected person did, and this is still my intent. But this is why it's okay that I hold the position, because the charter allowed it, or this ordinance allowed it, or this rule said that this is the process. So sometimes the angst is really about not understanding the rules and the process. So if you can kind of do that education campaign, that's helpful. And then also just, the commitment. Again, I'm here to serve you. I'm here to follow what I'm supposed to. I will follow the rules of the charter, of our ordinance, of our strategic plan, whatever it is. I'm committed to doing that in the same way I would have as if I'd run for office. Those are kind of the tips that I would recommend you use. Jamie, you have anything else?
No, but just like the rest of your presentation talked about the importance of communication, and that goes not only among yourselves as elected officials or staff members, but also with your community and citizens. So just like you mentioned, it's maybe they weren't aware of the process itself, and so just communicating that to them and making sure that everyone understands the playing field and what the rules of the game are.
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Do we have any more, Lisa?
Yeah, Rod Cross, if you want to go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question.
So, excellent presentation so far. I've really enjoyed it. One of the questions I have is, do you have any tips on how to get some counselors out of their shells? Because I have a counselor and maybe a couple others that at times don't want to give any explanation. They just move on and you call and nope, nothing. And I'd really like to know more about where they're coming from. I agree with what you were saying, and I think it's important that as a council, to become a team, we all got to understand where everyone, where their mindset is.
No, that's great, Mayor, and I like your background, by the way.
I do too.
Makes me wish I was there. So I do actually have a couple tips, and they're not mine. I'm stealing them from other city councils that I've seen. The first one I think that I have found that people find successful is where they actually set a time or set aside some time to get to know each other as human beings. So I'm thinking of one city council in particular. If their meeting starts at 6, they have all agreed to show up at 5:30, and they have like Subway or pizza delivered. And in that 30 minutes before the official meeting starts, they don't talk about city business. They just talk about life in general. And it almost kind of sets up just a natural dialogue for them to be having, and they already kind of learn about each other as people. So when they transition into the city business part of the day, they've already started a dialogue. So they're just kind of continuing on with that. I've seen some success with that. I've also seen the reality is some people are a little bit more introverted or quiet. They don't like the public aspect of being at a council meeting. It's too formal. And so what I've seen some cities do is they utilize a work session feature. So they have a work session every other week. They're still publicly noticed meetings, but there's no opportunity for public comment. They're not on public access television or Facebook Live if you do that. And it gives those people who are a little bit more introverted and kind of a safer space to share their thoughts and ideas. Those are two that I've seen work successfully. And then my last tip is sometimes it's good to just have, and we will get to this in a later section about public meetings law, but if you can meet with them privately in a way that doesn't create what's called a serial meeting and just kind of talk to them one-on-one as a person, this is where I think, what can I do to make you feel more comfortable like you can talk? Is there something that we should be doing differently? I always tell this funny story. I had 2 counselors who hated each other, Mayor. Hated each other. And they were already predisposed to dislike each other and disagree, but it was terrible. And finally, at some point, years and years later, we realized that what really set off Counselor A was that Counselor B would eat during each meeting, and Counselor A could not stand the sound of somebody chewing their food. And when we moved them to separate ends, Counselor A, who was consistently not talking because they were just mad all the time, started talking because they weren't focusing on this person eating next to them. So sometimes just having a one-on-one conversation, why aren't you participating? What can I do? What changes can I make to make you more comfortable? Might help with that particular issue. Jamie, you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic ideas, and I would absolutely recommend each of those things. And I think it's also important to remember that when you're a more senior counselor, or if you're the mayor, that not everyone has that same level of confidence. I think it's important as someone in a position of leadership to say, hey, what do you think? What's your opinion about this issue? Just welcoming and opening that door for someone to provide a comment that maybe they wouldn't feel as confident providing otherwise. I also completely agree that having the one-on-one sessions in a way that avoids a serial meeting, and just having, hey, check-ins. Hey, Counselor A, it's been 6 months. Anything that I can help you with to make you feel more comfortable? Any questions you might have? Who can I direct you to? I think those are all great ways to make the comfort level better.
Those are our tips, Mayor. Maybe some of them will work for you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Lisa, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we have a couple in chat. The first one is, should the city supply each counselor with the city documents?
Okay, so that's a broad question. And I don't know how to answer that. So if you're saying, should the city provide you with a packet of information for your meetings, that's pretty typical. What I will say is what the league is focused on is that each city is kind of its unique subset, and it's got to identify what works best for it. So what works great for the Portland Council may not be what works for the Medford Council, and what works for the Newport Council may not work for the Astoria Council. So those types of discussions are ones that you should be having as a council in general. What are the operating norms and your expectations as a council from your staff? What I would say, what I typically see across the state of Oregon is that before each meeting, staff provides their council a packet of information that goes through the agenda, has copies of ordinances. They typically provide you with copies of your budget, your code of ordinances, and then when you get into like specific documents, so hey, I heard that the planning director sent a notice of violation to Mr. Smith on J Street, and I want to see a copy of that. Different cities have different policies for how counselors get a copy of that, and that's one that you really need to work out as a city with your city administrator or city manager, because there's pros and cons for the variety of ways I've seen cities handle those.
Okay, and another question from the chat is, give an example of how to apologize for our contribution to a problem.
Okay, well, I hate apologizing, if that didn't become clear from the first one. I think the first part for me, a successful apology is one where you own the entire mistake. One of the worst things you can do is say, I'm sorry, but. I think but is a terrible word when you're giving an apology because it's actually taking away from some of the ownership that you have. And so what I like to say when you apologize, particularly in a professional setting, is own the whole thing. So, you know, if you got into a heated debate, perhaps during your council meeting, and maybe you raised your voice, and maybe you raised your voice because the other person had already been screaming and yelling at you. What I would say is approach the person and say, you know, at last Monday night's council meeting, I behaved in a way that was unprofessional, and I need to apologize for that. I raised my voice, I slammed my hand on the table, and that's not conduct that's professional, it's not respectful, and I want to apologize for that behavior. And that's it. If you would follow that up and say, but I only did that because you were already yelling at me, you're kind of taking away from your own ownership and putting it back on the other person. So just apologize specifically for your actions. I once had somebody say, well, I'm sorry for my actions, but I'm not sorry for the intent. And I think that can get a little gray, right? I mean, if you passionately defended an argument and you got a little loud or you started pounding, what I think you can say is, look, I let my passion for my belief kind of get in the way of how to be professional, and so I apologize. My intent was not to be unprofessional. My intent was to convey how much I care about this issue. So apologize for the stuff that you need to apologize for without saying but, and being respectful of the other person. And this one is hard. It's taken me a long time to get there, both as a person and as a professional. Is when I say that you need to own your own part, you need to own your own part regardless of what the other person does. So you apologize because you feel like you needed to apologize and you did something that wasn't right. And while it would be great if the other person would apologize for their part, don't apologize because you're expecting a response. Just apologize because you have something to apologize for yourself. Any other questions, Lisa? I'm trying not to look off camera at you.
I am not seeing any. There's just some comments in the chat, so be sure to read those if you are online. I got a new message. Okay. Hang on.
Sorry, we're trying.
Okay, LV, I see that your hand is raised if you want to go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Yes, hi, I'm LV Sutton from Silverton City Council. I'm new this year. I had a couple questions, but my main question is, in this day and age, we a lot of times see social media posts or updates on social media. And I, as a millennial, have access and I know how to use those platforms very, very well, but one thing I am struggling with is how to take older generations and even sometimes younger from a debate to dialogue scenario so we can be a little bit more productive and know what to bring to the table next time for work sessions. I think it's so easy to debate and not really get anywhere. I kind of want to figure out how I can use social media more as a tool and take it from debate to dialogue. Do you have any tips for me?
In the social media context, that to me is going to be hard. I think we've almost built social media to be a debate forum. I think it's almost hard to have a discussion. So I don't know that I have any tips per se on social media, except to be super mindful with it, because social media allows a certain level of anonymity and distance, and it would be a lot easier for me to kind of be combative with Jamie if I didn't have to sit we are 6 feet apart, sit 6 feet away from her and look her in the eye, right? If I could do that over the computer, it's there. So what I actually recommend is, particularly as it comes to the team that you're working with, whether it's with staff or council or a member of the Plan Commission, that you try and have those debates in person or at least live Zoom, so you can kind of respond to cues and decompress stuff. I think we say things on social media that we wouldn't necessarily say to somebody's face. In terms of how to turn a general conversation from debate to dialogue, it's really hard because I don't think we're wired to do that today. So I think what I have found successfully when I've done it, and Jamie and I do a lot of mediations and facilitations, is you almost become the person who starts asking questions as opposed to being the person who's giving answers. So if Jamie and I are having a debate, what I might do is, instead of continuing to hammer my point, is start asking Jamie a question. Okay, Jamie, can you explain to me more why you think that? Okay, so you said that you've heard from a lot of citizens. How many citizens? Are they from a particular neighborhood association? Were any of them businesses? Are they on a particular side of town? When the citizens were complaining, did they give you any tips? And so you start asking kind of questions, because what that does is it does two things. One, it starts getting more to the root of the issue that the other person's having, and it's also an opportunity for you to start learning where they're coming from. So from my experience, we're wired to debate, and if you are the person who wants to be committed to dialogue, you almost have to become a questioner in a respectful way, but a questioner to really figure out how you can get there, and then you kind of see where you stand.
Absolutely, and I think in my mind, when I think the difference between debate and dialogue is that debate, you're just spewing your side of the story, whereas to have a dialogue, you really have to listen to the other side. And so asking the questions kind of forces you to listen. It provides more facts. So that's hard to do on social media. You can't, I think when you're typing, you can kind of choose to ignore the comments you want to ignore. So I think trying to transfer that conversation to like the next Zoom meeting, or have a platform to say, this seems to be a hot button topic in the community. We want to have a dialogue. We want to have a discussion about it. Here's the time and place where that can occur. And so it's definitely hard. I mean, social media is kind of this new world that is really not new anymore, that we're still learning to adapt to.
Yeah, and if it's something you're having with your citizens instead of your council, what I've seen quite a few councilors and mayors do, particularly of late, is they kind of set up like a coffee hour in their community, which again, I realize we're in a pandemic and this is not necessarily possible at the moment, but they'll say, like the second Tuesday of every month, I'm going to be at this coffee house, and I'd love for you to come and chat with me and share your concerns. And they'll post that on social media and share it and promote it regularly. But then they're at the coffee house on that Tuesday, and their citizens can come in for 2 hours and talk with them individually. You can kind of almost create informal group networks of multiple citizens talking about issues. And I think that also helps with the dialogue better, again, because there's not that safe space of the nebulous internet to kind of protect you from other people's thoughts. Hopefully that's at least somewhat helpful. Do we have any more questions?
We do, and we are at time, but I promised this last question. Okay, so sure. Councilor Hinton, it sounded like you had a question, but you weren't sure how to raise your hand, but if you can unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Yes, Rod told me how to raise my hand. Thank you very much. I have a question. We are in the process of evaluating our reports, or our staff, the city manager, the city attorney, and our judge. And we have, one of them does not like the evaluation process at all. And so I'm just curious if there's other methods. I have a past life. I'm retired from working for a large city. And there have been different methods that the city used to get to be able to do an evaluation process. And I'm just curious if you have some tips on how to do that. We are moving through with our process this year, but for future years, we could really use some ideas.
Absolutely. So there's, and each city does it a little bit differently. I don't know that it's one that I can necessarily convey, but you're counselor with Lincoln City, right? If I remember. Am I
Yes,
correct?
I'm
All
ready.
right. I can remember. What I will do as soon as we're done is I will make a note to send out an email with some specific cities. What I would actually do the best way from my perspective is I would contact at least 2 people if it were me. So the first one I would do is I would reach out to CIS's pre-losses line, Katie or Tamara, and ask them if they've got some tips on evaluation processes because they work with a lot of different cities and review some personnel manuals. So there's probably some different evaluation processes that they can offer you. The second thing I would do is I would actually see if your city manager would post the question on the city manager's listserv. And the reason I say that is there's different cities from all over the state of Oregon do it completely differently. So I'm thinking, if I remember correctly, the former city manager for Lake Oswego did a really unique, I don't know all the specifics, but he had a really different take on how you should evaluate people over the years. He works now for PSU, but Lake Oswego might have an interesting process for you to take a look at. But if the city manager could post it on the listserv, my guess is you'd have probably somewhere between 10 to 15 different cities that you could contact and ask for their specific process. I wouldn't reinvent the wheel. I would actually just ask other people what they're doing and then kind of take the pieces and parts of those that you like and then create your own. I do think long term, what I would say is that any process that we use, whether it seems like it's still a great idea, we should be evaluating every 3 to 5 years, and that should include your evaluation process. The league's actually doing that right now. One of my goals next year is actually to take a look at our current evaluation process of our employees and figure out how to make it actually more meaningful and more valuable based on some of our strategic initiatives and some of our goals in our personnel manual. So I think it's good that you're taking a look at it, but I would that's what I would do. I'd talk with CIS or put something on the city manager listserv, and I'll make a note and I'll send you an email with some cities that I can think of off the top of my head that I know do things a little bit differently.
Okay, and I have a part B, which is how do we get the city manager to evaluate his senior staff?
So,
Or ideas and how to do it, different approaches.
yeah, so typically where you see evaluation requirements is in your personnel manual, so your city's personnel manual or your employee handbook, depending on how you call it. If, again, CIS has a model personnel manual, you can call Katie Comer or Tamara Jones. They're the 2 pre-loss attorneys, and they can share it with you. And in there, they have kind of a model outline for how you can do evaluations as a starting point. And it would just be what's ever in the personnel manual, and you would hold, that's what everybody's supposed to follow. So, and if you're struggling, not giving advice, what I've said, I've seen other cities do things before with their city managers when they're evaluating their city managers is they set up specific goals for the following year. So if one of the goals you want for that year is to reevaluate, redesign how, evaluations of city staff happens and bring it back, something like that, that can be a goal for 1 year. So I've seen some city councils work with their city managers in that way as they help co-create and craft goals for the city manager to try and accomplish in the following year.
Al, if you want to go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question.
Sure, it's Al Muehlhofer from Phoenix, and I've been on council now for about 6 months, and one of the questions that's come up is if I want to talk to counselors out of council meetings, there's been a difference of opinion on can I talk to them one-on-one? I realize the quorum in our case is 4 out of 6, but if I want to talk to 1, 2, or 3 counselors, is there anything forbidding me from doing that? It's just, so my question is, what are my options in talking to counselors offline, if you will, about different issues facing our town? Thank you.
That's a great question, Al, and it's good to see you again. I think Jamie and I last saw you in early August. So it's a great question. We're going to delve into it more in the public meeting section, but just kind of a touch base is there's a concept called serial meetings, and essentially what it says is that individual counselors can have a series of meetings amongst themselves at different times, on different days, and even through different mediums, and those different conversations can result in a quorum happening, and that would violate the public meetings law. So what I would typically tell you, particularly in your city, is to have a conversation with your city manager, and if you have a city attorney as well, with the city attorney, and find out what advice they want. There's a bunch of different interpretations of how far you can go with serial meetings.
The league always takes the most conservative approach possible, and what we generally tell people is that you should have conversations about city business in a public meeting in front of the citizens, since that's who you're working for. But you need to be mindful, because your one conversation with Counselor A, if Counselor A then went and talked with Counselor B, and then you also talked with Counselor B, you could have had a series of conversations amongst 4 council members, which could equal a quorum. So we'll talk more about that in the public meetings section, but as a general rule of thumb, you should have a conversation with your city manager and find out your own individual city's kind of risk-reward interpretations that you've had with your city attorneys.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have a couple questions in the chat. Can you suggest ways of onboarding new council and commission members?
That's a great question. So I'm going to give a tip or two, and then I'll ask Jamie as well. So first, I think you should come to Elected Essentials. So selfishly promote the LOC's program. I think Elected Essentials is a great way. In normal non-pandemic years, I think one of the best parts about the Elected Essentials program is honestly during the lunch hour and the breaks, because you can actually network with the 60 other people that are on the line with you right now in real time, which I think is helpful. I think that's good. I've seen a lot of councils, they actually have their own kind of onboarding process. So the city manager and the mayor, they kind of have just onboarding. They introduce you to all the department heads. They explain to you, expense policies, how you adopt an ordinance, how you go through a resolution. And they kind of have an almost internal school for the first few months. I've seen some city councils do that as well. Jamie, you have any other suggestions? Yeah, I think utilizing all the LOC resources, of course, Elected Essentials. We also have our website, which has a bunch of different resources on all sorts of topics. And then I think internally within your city, it could be very helpful to have some sort of like a mentorship system or a buddy system, where you have a more experienced council member or commission member kind of paired up with a newer one, just to kind of show them the ropes and to kind of go through those little nuances that might not be very easily explainable on paper. And then also serve as a resource to where that new counselor can ask those, I don't believe in stupid questions, but I sometimes feel like I ask stupid questions. And so having someone who's a safe person to ask those, how do I do this? I should know how to do this, but I don't know how to do it. Just a safe resource. I think that'd be very helpful. And I should say, for those of you that are watching, if your whole council couldn't come today, that's fine. You can register for some of the programming that we have tomorrow or next week or the following week. And then what we plan to do is we're going to take all the live Q&A sessions that we're recording, and well, we're not, our production company is going to combine all of those into one, and then those Q&A sessions, along with the actual lecture series that you've watched, will be available for download on the LFC's website, hopefully in January. So if you had a counselor who just could not attend in January, they should at least be able to watch the production themselves. And then if they had a question, they could just email or call me or Jamie, and we would answer it that way.
Okay, next question from the chat. Can you talk a little bit about what to do or how to handle when the entire city council is from one party and a new person comes onto council from a different party?
So that's a great question. In Oregon, most of your councils are actually nonpartisan, and I say that knowing that even though people are nonpartisan, you typically know what their party affiliation is, even if they're in the nonpartisan role. One of my favorite quotes, and I always get it wrong, and so I'm going to apologize. It's either from the former mayor of Austin or San Antonio, but he famously said one time, potholes are neither Republican nor Democrat. The citizens just want the pothole fixed. And so what I think is relevant when it comes to local government is to kind of start to find out what are the city's problems and approach them based on kind of those objective standards we talked about. So it wasn't in necessarily the video, but what you see a lot of councils do is they'll almost have a strategic plan. Some of them are 3 years, some of them are 5 years, and they kind of sit down and they collectively decide these are the issues that are facing our city. So are we looking to build a new park? Do we have an aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced? Where are we in terms of salary with our staff? Have we done a comprehensive overhaul of that to make sure that our hardworking staff are paid appropriately? And you kind of identify all of these issues that you have, and then you work together as a council to prioritize them, and you establish those goals, whether it's a year goal, a 3-year goal, or a 5-year goal. And that strategic plan becomes the guiding principle for the work that you do as a council. And what I find in my experience is if you can all agree on a set of goals that you want to accomplish, it makes some of those differences in politics go away, because what I think you'll find is you're going to come at it from different approaches, but if you've all already agreed on the end goal, the end path,
you almost have a way to kind of facilitate the consensus to get there. And that's kind of a good starting point. The second thing that I think is super helpful from my experience, we should absolutely encourage differences of opinions. I think that's what makes us unique. I think that's what makes this country what it is. But we also have to accept the fact that it doesn't inherently have to be a winner-take-all proposition. So what I always like to tell people is, you know, if you took a football field and I want to go 20 yards down the field and Jamie only wants to go 10, if we even only go 10, I'm still winning, right? I'm still ahead of where I wanted to be. And when we're at that 10-yard line, we can reassess and decide where we are. And then maybe I can show Jamie that, hey, look, we are here. And maybe we move 5 yards down the line. And then we move another 5. And eventually we get there. But part of that end result is really starting with having common goals and objectives. And then understanding that what you're really trying to do is work towards those, what I would say sometimes non-controversial issues. Let's just fix the pothole. Let's just make sure the citizens have clean drinking water and go from there. Jamie, you have any ideas? No, I think those are all, I think, the things that I would recommend. And yeah, focus on the non-controversial ones, the potholes, the infrastructure things that I think regardless of your political affiliation, these items need to be taken care of, and most people can agree on how to take care of them. And then I think also, you know, I fall on one end of the political spectrum, but I recognize that I can still learn something from somebody on the other end of the spectrum. I think you can always learn. Everyone has a valid viewpoint. So just be a little open-minded and don't just shut down somebody and refuse to have that conversation or dialogue that Patty talked about earlier in the presentation, just because you're assuming they have certain beliefs due to their political affiliation.
It's a good question, especially in today's times, though. Do we have any more questions, Lisa?
I don't see any more. We do have about 8 more minutes if anyone does have one.
Okay, so while we kind of fill time a little bit for those of you that are furiously typing in a question or trying to figure out how to raise your Zoom hand, I will just say one of the things that Jamie and I like to make clear when we have a little break here, especially for those of you that are newly elected or haven't really used the League in a while, one of the things that you get as a member of the League of Oregon Cities is access to what's called our member inquiry line. What that essentially allows you to do is you can contact me, Jamie, or another attorney in the League's office. His name is Colton Totland. He's our honors attorney. And you can ask us any question, and we will do our best to give you the answer. We don't provide direct legal advice, but we can get you in the right direction. We can provide you the resources, samples, models, guides, anything that you may need to make your job easier. And what I always like to tell people is, even if you don't think that we're the right person to ask, if we aren't going to be able to help you, you can still call or email us and ask, because if we aren't that right person, chances are we've been doing this long enough that we can tell you who you should connect with and who you should contact for assistance. And there's no charge for that. It's a free service, you get it. You can call us or email us directly, and we'll do our best to either give you the answer directly or find a resource for you where you can get the answers that you need. And any questions?
We do have another question. Jess Miller, if you want to go ahead and unmute your line to ask your question.
Hi, Jess Miller from Silverton. My question is, if we're in a career field that could have potential conflicts of interest with city council decisions and deliberations, when those roles interact, do you have guidance, or is that coming up later in the presentation about how to reduce either existing or perceived conflict of interest? Thank you.
It's a great question. So Jamie will actually touch on conflicts of interest specifically in the ethics segment, if you can watch that. She'll go through it in pretty lengthy detail with hypotheticals and give you some guidance on when you do or do not have a conflict and how to handle them if you do. I will ask Julie, do we have any questions in the queue?
We do. There's one from Teresa Nielsen. Other than LOC, are there other modes of continuing education? And then the next part is, what are the most effective means of objective assessments?
So if I take the education, you want to take the objective assessment one?
I will. That sounds great. It's a great question.
Okay, so in terms of, so the League has more than just this training program. If you go to our website, you'll actually see a training page, a training landing page. So we can do trainings on all types of things. So public contracting, if you want to learn about strategic planning, if you've got questions about customer service, land use, budgeting, we've got all types of trainings there. Another great resource, quite frankly, is a lot of the state agencies. So if you happen to be really involved in your city council's budget, there's a budget training you can get from the state. They've got all kinds of public contracting training as well. So there's a whole host of trainings between the league, the state, and then there's a lot of credentialed organizations. So if you're a mayor, you should really think about joining the Oregon Mayors Association. They have an annual conference every year, and it is limited just to mayors in Oregon, so you can attend and get a lot of cool training opportunities there. If you're a city manager or a new city manager, you can join the City County Managers Association that I mentioned Scott's a part of. They've got their own trainings every year. And if those aren't fitting the bill or it's just not working, I'm going to say this probably multiple times today. Just give us a call at the league. If we don't have a training opportunity that meets your needs, we will work with you to try and find one that can. And Scott, I'll let you take the second part.
Thanks. It's an excellent question. Going into an objective assessment, it's a complicated question really, but I would say that trying to define what it is you're trying to do right out of the gate as a city council, what is the objective you're trying to tackle? What is the goal specifically you're trying to achieve? And the more clearly you can define what it is we're trying to do, the more that will lead into a process or a solution or a method of implementation that you can go back and then over time see if it's actually accomplishing what it is that you set out to do. And so the best way of having an objective assessment is clearly defining what it is that you're trying to accomplish. The other thing I'd add too is that sometimes it's difficult for us to measure what we do in local government because we don't generate return on profit. What is the benefit of adding a teen center worker as it relates to the reduction of maybe crime in a neighborhood? We like to think there's a relationship between those two things, but it's difficult to get your arms around. Those are hard things to measure, which is why we have community engagement and community process. What does our community expect? And are we meeting those needs? And are the strategies we're using accomplishing the community's expectations?
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. Do we have any more questions in the queue, Julie?
There are none in the chat, and no one has raised their hand yet.
Okay, so I'm going to give all of you out there who are just slow typers, are trying to get brave enough to raise your Zoom hand a chance, a few minutes there just to kind of talk about how the rest of the day is going to go in case it's not clear. So after each pre-recorded session, we will have these live Q&As. I think I said it at the start of the video, but I just want to remind everybody, if you think of a question during one of the programs, remember to write it down so you can ask it for us at the end of the sessions. The other thing to note is that when we finish the entire day, if you've thought of questions at the end and you're like, oh, I wish I would have asked Patty or Scott this question earlier, ask it at the end. We'll try and get it in. And then worst case, we had to do this yesterday. We had more questions than we had time. Still feel free to type in your questions or email us. And what we will do is we will take those questions, we'll find the answers, and we'll email you directly within 48 hours. The goal is for you to have as many opportunities to ask your questions and for us to provide your answers as we can today. One last time, Julie, do we have anybody else who's asked a question?
What is a good way to address it when council rules are not being followed?
Do you want to take a stab at that one?
I will. I'll take a shot at that. So Patty did a really good job talking about the importance of relationships. Being a newly elected official, oftentimes you have a lot of energy. You got hot off the campaign. You've got your mind's full of ideas, things that you want to accomplish, and then you realize that your ability to get things done is really dependent on your ability to have relationships with your peers. And so what are the understanding of council rules, and are they working? Council should be able to have conversations about how their meetings are going. In fact, it's one of the things I often ask right out of the gate. How do you think the council meetings are going? Are they being run in a way where everybody feels like they have an opportunity to be heard? Have you talked with your mayor about how the meetings are being run and talked about this? And so during a goal setting or a retreat, talking about what are the council rules? How are the meetings being run? These are really important questions to ask because they set the tone moving forward. And there could be consensus developed around that. Now, you may not always get your way when you're talking about how council meetings are run or how decisions are made or how the council rules are being applied, but it's healthy to have that conversation. And for the sake of having good relationships for the interests of the community, you can talk about those things in a way that I think is healthy, even during the meeting. How is this decision being made tonight? How is this deliberation occurring? What is the role of the public that are here tonight in this process? It's healthy to have those conversations. So I would say talk about it and try to have your concerns addressed and try to build consensus with your peer city councilors.
That's great, Scott. The other thing I would add is if you go back to the tips I had on communication, what I think is key when you think that there might be a rule violation is really focus on using your I statement in that instance. Instead of saying, you, Counselor Y, are not following the rules, it's, I just have a question. Is rule whatever applicable here? Are we supposed to be doing this? Put the onus on you, because as Scott mentioned, it's really important to have that professional dialogue and work together. And I think one of the fastest ways to lose that is to start doing you statements instead of making them as I statements.
And you know, Patty, I think you also find too, at least in my experience, is that your other city councilors may not realize, or the mayor may not realize that you're not getting called on. You know, it could be a situation where the way you sit around the diocese, you can't, the mayor, he or she can't see you out of the corner of their eye or something. So by raising these issues, they can often be addressed. Very rarely have I ever seen rule violations occur intentionally. Usually it's in the heat of the moment, there's a big audience. People are trying to get through the meeting. And so this is why it's good to have healthy conversation.
It's my understanding that we already have at least one question in the queue. So I will go to Denise. What's our first question?
Well, it is, how do you build trust and create relationships with your council legally? For example, without breaking open meeting laws, you can't all go out for beers together.
Well, that's actually not entirely true. You can't all go out for beers together and talk about city business, but you can still socialize. In fact, if you would ever read the Oregon Attorney General's Manual on Public Meetings, they very clearly state that you can have social gatherings where you actually connect with each other on that human level. So I think that you should try and do those things. What I've seen some cities do successfully is some councils, let's say for example your council meeting starts at 6 p.m. I know of one council where they provide like Subway or some form of pizza or potluck, and everybody agrees to get to the council chambers at say 5:15, and they eat dinner together. And the rule is while we're eating dinner, they don't talk about city business. They're trying to get to know each other as human beings to kind of build that trust and development. Another great way to do it is through team building exercises. Everybody always talks about those rope courses, or you decide to volunteer together. I know some city councils have participated in neighborhood cleanups, or they volunteer at food banks and stuff during the holiday seasons. It's kind of another way to gain camaraderie. So you can certainly, and you should, have social instances where you can gain knowledge of each other, but you need to be clear that you're not talking city business when you do it. It really is an opportunity to connect on that personal level instead of the professional level that you do when you're in city council meetings. It's a good question. Do we have any more, Denise?
We don't at the moment, no.
Okay, so for those of you that might be trying to figure out how to type in the question or think furiously about it, I'm gonna kind of use some of this dead space to tout how you can reach me with other questions, especially if you're a newly elected official or new staff person here in Oregon. So as part of your membership dues for the League of Oregon Cities, you get access to what we call the League's member inquiry line. And what that essentially is you can call the League or email us, and one of the three attorneys, myself, Assistant General Counsel Jamie Hafner, or our honors attorney Colton Totlin, will help you answer that question. Now, we don't provide legal advice, but we do provide you guidance and resources. So for example, we'll talk about public meetings in a little bit, but let's say you're a city recorder and you can't remember the rules, the restrictions about how to have an emergency meeting, what the notice requirements are. We can find you that information from the Attorney General's manual. We can pull the statute from you. We can send you some resources, and we will give all of that to you. And it's totally free of charge. You're welcome to use it at any time. Because the League's offices are still technically closed because of the pandemic, quite frankly, the best way to reach us is through email. But we're happy to answer any of those inquiries, whether it's today or 2 years from now. It's a service you get as part of your dues, and I encourage you to do it. As I've been sitting here filling space, do we have any more questions, Denise?
Just more of a general one. Slides will be provided for this for people coming in later and want to catch up on this.
Absolutely. In fact, what we plan to do is we're actually doing 6 elected essentials. We kind of tried to break you up regionally. And once we finish all 6, we're going to take the Q&A sections from all of them and kind of mash them together. And then by January, what we hope to do is put the videos with kind of the mashed together Q&As on our website so that you can share them yourself. So if you have counselors who couldn't attend, or if in 6 months you want a refresher on, say, public meetings law, you could download it and play it at your council meeting or for city staff as well.
Okay, great. We do have another question in the chat.
Okay.
How do you talk about an issue with city council members outside of meeting without violating the rule? Is talking with staff a problem?
Talking with staff is not a problem. And so we'll get into this a little bit more when we do the public meetings. But what the public meetings law applies to is the governing body itself. So all of your councils and the mayor. So staff isn't part of the governing body, so you can have questions with them. Generally speaking, when we get in the public meeting session, I'll talk more about the pros and cons of trying to have conversations with counselors outside the public meeting context. A spoiler alert, I don't recommend it. But generally speaking, you should always assume that those rules only apply to the governing body itself, not the staff who assists them.
Okay, and then in the chat, Steve is asking to be called on. So Steve, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you. This is quite lengthy. I ran on the citizens and I working as a team. And so I told them, I says, if there's a contentious issue or something like that that you would all like the council to look at, to please show up at a council meeting instead of like going on Facebook and complaining and stuff like that. Show the council that you're really interested and us work as a team together instead of me just going up there and saying, well, I've been talking to the citizens and this is what they, want to see.
I think that's great, and my guess is that your city council during its meetings probably has a portion for public comment, and I think that that's where you should encourage people to do it. I look at engaging with the citizens as part of your job, as part of the whole council's job, because they are part of the overall team, and I think it's appropriate for councilors and mayors, city managers as well, to have conversations with the citizens. I know some councilors or mayors, they set aside a day a week or a day a month where they're in a public space so the citizens can just come and talk to them, coffee shop, farmer's market, what have you. Some people are intimidated by council meetings, so some councilors have told me they get a lot more response when they meet with their citizens outside of that context. But then also encourage a robust public comment period during your council meetings. Make sure you give them an opportunity to be heard, because we do all, as councilors, you work for them, and we all have to pull together as a community in order for our city to be successful and resolve the difficulties and issues that we're facing.
In developing strategic goals or a strategic plan, is this done in a public setting, i.e. a public meeting? And when a council completes a strategic plan, is this open for public comment?
That's a really good question. So typically, for me, I use the word public meeting versus public hearing differently. So a public meeting is where the public has to be allowed to come and watch, but they may not necessarily be allowed to participate. And typically in public hearings, there is an opportunity for them to participate through public comment. What I have typically seen with strategic plans and developing goals is that you have more of a work session as a council with your staff. And so the public can usually sit in the back and watch, but they're not allowed to give comment, ask questions. It's really an opportunity for the council to work with their staff to identify their goals. The strategic plan is then typically adopted at one of your regularly noticed public meetings, and then the public can typically comment on that. Some cities use a much more robust process. Sometimes they will actually seek public comment and feedback from the beginning, kind of do almost a community visioning strategy, if you will, and they'll send out surveys and they'll have open houses where the citizens can kind of come in and say, these are our priorities, this is what we want the city to be focusing on. And then the cities will take that feedback and that information and they'll bring it into their strategic plan development to make sure they've heard from their citizens. The key really with any strategic planning session, in my experience and opinion, is to make sure that you've got a plan in place for how you want it to look and how you want it to run. If you're a city that has a city manager or administrator, they're probably a good place to start because they've probably done this before. If not with your community, then certainly with others. Do we have any other questions, Julie?
Yes, next question. Legally, how do I communicate with other council members? By phone or in person? Under what circumstances would I do this?
So I love this question, and we're going to get really into this issue in the session on public meetings. But in case you can't stay for that, I will kind of do a brief synopsis. So in Oregon, we have to worry about essentially a quorum of the governing body meeting outside of a publicly noticed meeting. If we do that, then we violated the state's public meetings law. We call those type of meetings serial meetings. And what that essentially means is you have a series of individual counselors meeting with each other at different times that equal a quorum. So let's say you had a 7-person council, 4 people would be a quorum. So if Counselor A and B have a conversation about something, let's say an ordinance is about to be passed on the telephone, and then Counselor A emails Counselor C about it 3 days later, and then Counselor C and D talk about it at their kid's soccer game 2 days later, you have had a series of individual meetings that results in a quorum, and that would be a violation of the public meetings law. So what we typically tell people is that as long as you don't talk to more than a quorum of your council, and they also don't talk to more than a quorum, you're probably not going to have a public meetings law violation. But you got to be careful, because remember, if you just talk with one person and you think they're safe, and then they talk to somebody who also talks to somebody, you could be in trouble. So the league's position, and we take an incredibly conservative approach, each city is going to have to do its own risk-reward analysis working with their city attorney, but the league's conservative approach is that if you want to discuss city business, you ought to be doing it in front, in a city meeting, whether that's a work session where the public can watch but not participate, or in a council meeting where the citizens can make public comment as well. But the conservative approach is that you discuss city business in a publicly noticed meeting. Do we have any more questions, Julie?
We have a raised hand from Matt Keating. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. What are your thoughts about city business, maybe a future agenda item, or discussing a potential or a meeting you may have had in the digital space, social media, Facebook? Does that trigger a potential open meetings violation?
It can, and so again, we'll get more into it when we do the public meetings, but as a general rule of thumb, if you're talking about city business, you should assume that that could result in a public meeting violation if you reach a quorum that's not noticed. The Attorney General has even gone so far as to opine that it's not just enough that you're talking about decisions you're going to have to make. If you're simply gathering information about city-related business, that in and of itself could also equate to enough to have a public meetings violation if more than a quorum participate. So it's not just enough to say, well, I'm talking about something that we may do in 9 months. If it's about city business, you need to be mindful of not hitting a quorum for public meeting purposes.
Outside of COVID, can we all attend an event or get together to socialize?
Absolutely. And so the state statute and the Attorney General are very clear. It's perfectly acceptable for the entire council to socialize. You just can't discuss city business while you're socializing. In fact, I would say in trying to build that team dynamic, it's important for you to get to know each other on a human level instead of just a work level. And there's some interesting ways I've seen cities do this. I know of one city council, for example, where their meeting starts at 6, but they get together at 5:15. And the city council orders pizza, or they get like sub sandwiches from somewhere. And the kind of the rule of thumb is that first 45 minutes, they're just eating dinner together, and they're not talking about city business. They're literally socializing and kind of relating to each other on that human level to kind of form those personal bonds. I know of several city councilors who are, you know, they go to big festivals together, they have barbecues, but the key is to really make sure that you're not discussing city business. And for those of you that are newly elected, this is probably a good point to tell you that even though having a completely social gathering with your fellow counselors does not violate the public meetings law, you need to be mindful that citizens are going to pay attention to you in a way they have never paid attention to you before. And so sometimes perceptions are an issue. So what I always encourage those counselors who are going to socialize together is to make it really clear if somebody would complain that you all had an agreement, you weren't discussing city business, no city business was happening. This is the parameters we have, and I abide by it, because your citizens may not always see it that way, and so you may have to explain what they're perceiving in terms of how it relates to the actual law itself. Any other questions, Julie?
There are no other questions and no other hands raised.
Okay, so before we call it a day on this particular session, I do want to take just 2 minutes of your time to tell you about the League's member inquiry program, assuming that some of you, if not all of you, are brand new.
So your city pays dues to be a member of the League of Oregon Cities each year. And one of the benefits, aside from a host of benefits that you get, but one of the big benefits you get is the opportunity to call the league with your questions or your concerns. And what you usually do is you get a hold of me, Jamie Hafner, who's the Assistant General Counsel, or Colton Totland, who's our honors attorney. And we can help you provide those answers. So it can be as simple of, we want to hold an emergency meeting, but we don't know how much notice we have to give. We can find the statute that tells you how to do that. Hey, Patty, we're looking at trying to adopt a new sewer rate ordinance. Can you tell me what cities of my size are charging their residents? We're looking to enact a resolution establishing some type of program. Do you have any examples from other cities? We can help you do all of those things. What I generally like to tell people is, even if you don't think the league is the right place to ask, still start with us, because if we can't help you, 90% of the time we know who can help you, and we can put you in contact with those persons or those entities. So if you take anything away from today, one of the key things I'd ask you to remember is that if you have a question, shoot the league a call or an email, and we'll do our best to get you the answer or put you in touch with somebody who can. It's one of the key services we provide our members, and it's something that you should hopefully keep in mind and take note of when you leave here today. One thing that Jamie and I like to encourage people to do, particularly if you're newly elected in office, is to remind you of one of the main benefits you get from being a member of the League of Oregon Cities is you can call us with questions whenever you have them. We call it our member inquiry program. And what essentially that means is that you have a question about anything really that's related to your work for the city. You can send Jamie or I an email, you can call us, and we'll do our best to answer. We generally cannot provide legal advice, but we can provide you copies of statutes, we can provide you research tools, we can provide you guidance and models. So if you're a city recorder and you can't remember what's the absolute minimum amount of notice you have to give before you hold a public meeting, Jamie and I can find the statute for you and we can send it to you. If you're a mayor and you really want to know what the charter provisions in cities of your size look like, you can give us a call. We'll pull up those populations, identify the cities for you, and we can send you those charters. If you're a city manager and you've been asked to write an ordinance that deals with business licenses, you can call us and Jamie and I can give you a model business license ordinance, and we can find some ordinances in cities your size. So what we like to tell people generally is that if you have a question or an issue and you don't know where to start with the league. Even if we don't have the answer or the resource for you, we usually know who does. And all of that service that we provide, that's free of charge to you. You get that automatically when you pay your membership dues each year. Any questions yet, Lisa?
So this was Peter.
Okay.
We should talk more about understanding the history of council decisions to be able to contribute better.
I agree with that. So it's not uncommon for a couple of things to transpire when you're newly elected in offices. One, sometimes a lot of people run because they didn't like what a previous city council did, and so they want to undo it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I always encourage my counselors when I worked with them to do was at least go back and read some of the history and the reasoning and the rationale behind the actions the prior council took. Again, it may not change your mind or your perception, but it's going to give you context and understanding of what happened. And secondly, when you come in, you're joining a team and you're going to create a new team, but there's probably already team norms in place. And it's useful if you can understand why those norms exist. Jamie, would you add anything else?
Yeah, no, I think I agree that a lot of times people, they run for office because they were unhappy about an issue or something, they didn't understand why something went a certain way. And it is important, though, to look back at the history, at the minutes, to learn why something happened, because a lot of times the public doesn't realize that public officials have to do things a certain way, or city funding is only allocated a certain way. And that can be a steep learning curve once you get into office. So I always say, don't assume the worst in people. Try to learn why certain decisions were made. And as Patty said, it's okay if you still don't agree with why those decisions were made a certain way, but be open to learning.
Okay. Next question. I think nepotism is on today's agenda. If not, may I inquire, is extreme cases actually illegal or merely mostly inappropriate?
Nepotism, excuse me, I can't speak this early in the morning. Nepotism is on the agenda. Jamie's actually going to cover it later this morning in the ethics section. So if it's okay, since it seems like you're going to be somebody who will wait, we'll let Jamie tell you all about nepotism during the ethics session. Anything else?
I don't, oh wait. Okay, yes. I am a new mayor, and I have never been involved in city government before. Sorry, I've got stuff popping on my screen. I am not sure who is the one supervising our city recorder. We have a council and a public works director. Can you help me understand in general who would be the recorder's supervisor?
Absolutely. So first, congratulations and welcome to local government. Hopefully you like it as much as Jamie and I do, although we were never brave enough to run for office. So what I would tell you, Mayor, is the first thing you want to do is pull out your city charter. So in my experience, that charter is going to tell you exactly who is responsible for what. So it's going to be the mayor. You're probably going to want to look at a couple places. In my experience, most charters are going to give out specific authority and duties for the mayor, specific authority and duties for the city councilor, and also for the city recorder. If that's not specifically defined, so if it's not in there, the second place I would also start to look is at the city recorder's job description. So there's probably a job description somewhere on file, and usually within most job descriptions, it's going to tell you who the city recorder reports to. My guess is if you are super small and you only have a city recorder and a public works director, it's probably the council as a whole that supervises the recorder. That would be common, not necessarily the only option, but you're going to want to look at your charter and the job description. Those are the first two places that I would look. Any other suggestions, Jamie?
Nope, that's what I would recommend.
Any last questions, Lisa?
I do not, so maybe we do.
Was that a no or a yes? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we do.
Okay.
I'm just, okay, so a question I have is how can a council practice? This might be a better question for public meetings trainings.
How can a council practice?
Practice.
So I'm not sure what you mean by practice. If you mean kind of run through what you need to do or what you want to do. So there's a couple things that we suggest. So if you're trying to just practice in terms of how you work together or your meeting practices, there's nothing that says that you can't have what I like to call a work session. So a lot of times in local government, you have your public meetings, and then some cities go a step further and they have public work sessions, or they call them workshops. Some people call them study sessions. And in a public meeting, generally speaking, that's when you get to have public comment. So the public not only gets to attend the meeting, they also get to comment on certain items on the agenda. During a work session or a study session, the public still gets to attend, but they're not allowed to participate. They don't give public comment. And a lot of times in work sessions, you'll almost see sometimes the room set up differently. So in my council, when we had a public meeting, all of my councilors sat at the dais. It was much more formal, and staff sat in a certain place, and you had a podium for public comment. When they were in a work session format, they actually sat more at like a conference table. So it was clear they were only working together as a group, and the public, if there was any, were kind of sitting outside that group against the wall. If I was looking to practice anything or get more information, I would encourage you to consider the work session route, because then it's much more about the internal group. You're going to have observers, but they're not necessarily participating in the same way they would a public meeting.
Okay, Anna Byers, if you want to go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question. Oh, she put it in the chat. I can read it from the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself. Okay. Is there a stance on relationship building between council members on the team and the city government members of a team? I would assume that this sort of effort is key to developing a healthy, dynamic team. However, I have observed in some city governments a bit of distance between the council members and city employees.
Yeah, so in that situation, I would encourage you, if you're a big enough city that you have a city administrator or a city manager, then you want to remember that it's the city manager and the city administrator who's responsible for managing staff. And so a lot of times that distance you've seen is really more of a separation of powers, so there's no blurring the lines. And the reason that's important is I'll give you an example from my own life. So even though staff knows that they don't respond, that they don't report to the council, that the council's not their boss, the city manager is, you're still seen as the people that are ultimately in charge. You kind of have all of the power. And so, for example, we had a public works employee, a street superintendent, who received a call from one of my counselors who said, hey, I want to let you know that there's a pothole on Grant Street. And
The counselor was literally just trying to report a pothole the same way a citizen would, is to say, look, I just was down the street and I saw a pothole. And the street superintendent took it as a direct order that that pothole needed to be filled immediately. And he pulled all of his people off jobs they were already working on to immediately fix that pothole. And so what you'll see with a lot of city managers, I think rightfully so, is to try and establish what those separations are so those types of confusion don't happen. I think what I always tell people is you want to have a conversation, a frank conversation with the city manager and the city administrator, identify what their expectations are, what their preferences are. A lot of times it's common for city managers. I've seen some city managers who said, look, I don't care if you're emailing or communicating with my department heads because they understand the difference between you asking them a question versus giving them a directive, but I want to be CC'd so I'm in the loop. Some say I want everything to come through me. It's really a conversation and dialogue you need to be having directly with kind of the person who's ultimately responsible for all of the staff. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that as elected officials, you might think of yourself, or I'm just the neighborhood, mom, where everyone comes to my house to hang out, or I'm just the little league coach. But as an elected official, you have this level of almost like intimidation to like the general public or to even staff members. And I know someone like me personally, in the past, I've been very easily intimidated by elected officials, even at the local level. And so while, like in the example Patty mentioned with the pothole, it's just a well-meaning comment, hey, this pothole needs fixing. They could have made that comment as an average citizen, but because they were elected official, that staff member took it in a way that probably wasn't intended. So just be careful that you do hold a position of power, and that can be interpreted a little differently to a staff member or other members of the public.
Yeah, just work with your staff and find out what works best, and you'll figure out a way to kind of move together seamlessly. For now, we'll call this live Q&A session a day, and we will see you again in a little bit. Thanks, everyone.